Firstpost reports from the world's second largest continent. Hello, I'm Alyson Le Grange. A very warm welcome from Durban, South Africa. We get you the news and the newsmakers from Africa. From elections to climate change to innovations and opportunities. As the world's attention shifts, we report from Africa, the heart of the global south. Join me every weekday live on Firstpost. Hello and welcome to Firstpost Africa, where we get you the top stories from the continent and from across the world. I'm Alyson Le Grange, coming to you live from Durban, South Africa. First, let's take a look at the headlines. Israeli tanks advance deeper in the southern Gaza Strip, forcing Palestinians in Khan Yunis to flee, as Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu addresses the US Congress later today. Russia accuses the US of stoking tensions in the Arctic and dismisses Washington's concerns that increasing cooperation between Moscow and Beijing could impact regional stability. A passenger plane crashes after takeoff in Nepal's Kathmandu. Only the pilot was able to survive the flaming wreckage, as all 18 others on board were killed. Heavy rain hits northern Philippines, triggering floods in the capital Manila as Typhoon Yoweri intensifies. Rescuers deployed to evacuate people from low-lying areas. And Spain's antitrust watchdog opens a probe into the conditions that Apple imposes on developers of mobile applications sold in its App Store. The regulator says it could amount to infringement of competition rules. Hello and welcome. Our top focus remains on Uganda. Authorities have charged and put several young protesters behind bars as rallies against corruption in the African country gathered steam despite warnings from authorities. In Uganda's capital, Kampala, there was heavy military and police deployment in order to deter the protesters. However, despite a ban, people came out onto the streets in huge numbers. Clashes broke out as riot police intervened to break the protests. The police officials were also seen manhandling some protesters, and videos show many protesters being pushed into the police van while they continued to chant anti-corruption slogans.
Respect human rights! Respect human rights!
The deployment has really affected the turnout of the protesters, I'd say, because in the past these peaceful protests have turned violent because of police presence. So we all expected most people not to show up because of the fear and also the intimidation that is still evident in the streets. Like several streets have been blocked.
Around 60 people have been detained by the police, including a prominent TV and radio presenter, Isa Salima, as well as 3 young protest leaders. After the arrest, they were presented before the courts and remanded in custody on charges that include being a common nuisance. That basically means someone who interferes with the rights of the general public. Now, young Ugandans who are inspired by the protests in neighboring Kenya organized the Tuesday rallies using social media. They are furious over the endemic corruption in Uganda. Several high-profile Ugandan figures have recently come under the spotlight in graft scandals. Now, these include the Parliament Speaker, Anita Among, who was slapped with the US and UK sanctions over corruption earlier this year. Protesters specifically demand her resignation.
I want Anita Among to resign. She has stolen from this country. These resources are not hers. This is taxpayers' money. I am urging all the young people out there in Uganda to come out in large numbers.
Uganda's President Yoweri Museveni, who had warned protesters against playing with fire and asked them to call off their march, has repeatedly argued that he has done enough to make sure the corrupt culprits are prosecuted. However, the opposition says that he has shielded those politically close or related to him. Museveni is also known for suppressing the opposition. He has been able to maintain his iron-fisted rule for almost 4 decades now, with a frequent crackdown on opposition and journalists. On the eve of the protests, Ugandan authorities besieged the headquarters of the opposition National Unity Platform, or the NUP party, of former presidential candidate Bobi Wine. They also arrested 3 of his party's MPs. Opposition has extended its support for the rallies, but the rallies, which are somewhat inspired by those of Kenya, are not influenced by any political party. The youngsters are organizing and mobilizing the protests on their own. Protesters say as Kenyans and Ugandans face similar problems, they are implementing the same protest model.
We are one East Africa. Their blood is our blood. Their protests have given us the courage to come out and stand for our rights as well.
While young protesters have been able to put intense pressure on the Kenyan authorities and gain significant concessions for themselves, will Ugandan authorities too bow down to public pressure? Now, for more on this, we have with us Mutungisa Edgar, who is a political commentator and the 7th East African Community Youth Ambassador to Uganda. Mutungisa joins us live from Mbarara in Western Uganda. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you so much.
Now, how has the government responded to the protests? We know that many of the demonstrators have been detained. And what measures have been taken to address the corruption allegations?
Yes, thank you so much. So I think in my experience, the government has been able to respond to those protests in a way I would describe as cowardice, but also illegal and brutal. Because when you compare the example, right, just before the protest started, a day before the protest that was on Monday, the government deployed military. There was a lot of military in the city that someone would think perhaps the government was fighting Al-Shabaab. I think that is very sad for a country that ought to aspire to democratic values. Because when you compare with our counterparts in Kenya, because I've been following the politics and the demonstrations around the region, I think they were more peaceful. And the response by the police in Kenya was a little more patriotic, because you would see instances where the police was actually safeguarding protesters. But here in Uganda, it was the opposite. Right before the election started, there was already military deployment and not just police deployment. And I think that was very sad. But also it continues to show how cowardice the government was getting. And I think that is something that the young people should be proud of as an outcome. And also, we greatly believe, given the current scope, because we are seeing that Deputy Parliament Speaker is trying to change, is trying to make statements that allow room for debate of corruption in the flow of Parliament, which was not happening previously. I think that is going to change the scope of our politics going forward.
And what role have young people in particular played in organizing and participating in these protests, given that a significant portion of Uganda's population is under the age of 35?
Well, yes, actually, I think the young people have done very greatly well, because they have organized themselves, and they did this without even the leadership of their national youth structures. In fact, currently on ground, the young people are clashing with their youth structures, because they're asking their youth leaders where have they been? Because the youth leaders were silent on corruption. So the young people organized themselves using social media because that's the only tool they can still control in a government which is largely dictatorial. And I think that is something which is very important. But also the young people have been able to stand for their own. Recently, when the young people were detained and were in police yesterday, we saw a lot of very many youth coming up to stand as sureties in trying to help the young people secure police bonds so that they can be off the prisons. So all these young people are doing it on their own behalf and themselves. And there's so much solidarity which is coming from different guild councils, student council associations, asking for these youth leaders, but also other MPs to come up and calling them on hashtags so that they can be able to come and speak against corruption, because most of them have been silent. And I think it's a very interesting development, really. Yeah.
Right. And Mutungisa, what impact have these protests had on public opinion, as well as governance, and importantly, accountability in Uganda?
Yes, actually, I think there has been some progress, because even before, just on the announcement of this march to parliament, we saw some ministers, a permanent secretary, a corrupt permanent secretary to a ministry was arrested. So while the young people were announcing that we are going to march to parliament against corruption, we are seeing some action already being taken. So I think there is some fear which has already been instilled, particularly also the president of the country, and I think that is very important. But also given the deployment of security, because this has never happened before. There are very many raids that used to happen, but the government would respond just when the raids have already happened. But this time around, we saw a lot of fear from the government. And I think it has also been very clear that the young people are tired of corruption. And I think the officials who have been engaging in it have got to rethink, or at least they've been motivated to rethink, because the young people have shown that they will go to all the extreme lengths to ensure that they fight these people. And we are seeing young people continuously using this social media tool, which I think is going to change our public opinion, and is already changing the public opinion, because there's so much debate happening already on even restructuring how our youth councils operate, because the young people have felt their silence and they're very saddened by it. So we think accountability is going to rise, and I think there is already going to be a lot of net advantages that are going to come because of these rights. I think there's going to be some progress.
Yeah. Mutungisa, thank you very much for being with us on Firstpost Africa.
Thank you.
Shifting focus to Kenya, where weeks of anger against the ruling government is only intensifying further. In the Kenyan capital, Nairobi, protesters erupted once again despite a police ban. In the latest, angry protesters have vowed a total shutdown as they threaten to seize the Jomo Kenyatta International Airport in Nairobi. It is one of the busiest airports in Africa. Police had warned against the march, saying trespassing on protected areas, including the airport, would risk prosecution. Reports say some protesters did mobilize a march to Nairobi's main airport, but were met with heavily armed police force deployed there. Kenyan police had deployed around 3,500 officers across the city to prevent protesters from accessing the airport. Kenyan army soldiers also joined police at the airport. According to reports, at least one person was shot and seriously injured, and 5 were arrested around 15 kilometers from the airport. Meanwhile, protests continued in other parts of Nairobi. At least 5 protesters were arrested during the Tuesday protests. Many shops and offices were shut in Nairobi, and Kenyan police fired tear gas to prevent scuffles between protesters and government supporters. In the coastal city of Mombasa, police fired tear gas at dozens who had gathered in the city centre. Elsewhere in the country, people lit bonfires in the western town of Migori and the central Karatina, as per the local media. Now, as the fresh protests broke out as the lower house of Kenyan Parliament resumed a debate on the controversial finance bill. The bill, which was tabled in May of this year, proposed several tax increases. However, public anger forced President William Ruto to scrap all of the tax hikes. But the protests have now turned into a wider campaign against the government and corruption. Many now want William Ruto to resign. At least 50 people have been killed and more than 400 wounded in the youth-led protests. Ruto has attempted to make key concessions to the protesters. He announced a new cabinet last week, but retained 6 ministers from the previous cabinet, which sparked anger. However, earlier today, he nominated more cabinet members, which include 4 opposition heavyweights. This is an effort for a new broad-based cabinet that he promised in response to the nationwide protests.
I have now forwarded the name of John Mbadi Ngongo to the Ministry of National Treasury and Economic Planning, Salim Mvuria Mgala, Ministry of Investment, Trade and Industry, Ms. Rebecca Miano, Ministry of Tourism and Wildlife, the Honorable James Opio Wandai, Ministry of Energy and Petroleum.
The protests in Kenya have entered its 6th week, and they have also inspired the youngsters in other African countries. Will these protests be the origin of a mass Gen Z-led movement in Africa? Moving to Ethiopia now, in the remote mountainous area of Gofa Zone, tragedy struck twice in rapid succession. Heavy rains triggered 2 devastating landslides, claiming the lives of at least 229 people. The death toll, which rose sharply from the initial one of 55, included many who rallied together to search for survivors. But as the second landslide hit, the debris buried rescuers alongside those who sought to be saved.
We are still searching for bodies, but the death toll surged after the people who came to rescue also got trapped. So far, we don't have exact numbers as we are identifying casualties. When we complete the investigation, we will make everything public. It is a very sad incident.
Hundreds of people gathered at the scene with their faces etched with despair. Footage showed them digging tirelessly, their hands clawing through the dirt in desperate hope of finding those missing. Local authorities said at least 5 people were pulled alive from the mud and were receiving treatment in hospital.
The devastation is huge and beyond our capacity. As a result, there are a lot of people who were uprooted from their livelihoods in the area. The area is now uninhabitable. We need to also work on relocating these people. We call upon all stakeholders, aid organizations, volunteers, and the business community to lend their hand and stand with our community.
The UN's Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs notes that the region has faced particularly heavy rains and flooding due to the impact of climate change. Angofa, which is located approximately 320 kilometers southwest of the capital, is no stranger to such calamities. Between April and early May, the UN agency said that floods caused mass displacement, affecting more than 19,000 people in several zones and causing damage to livelihoods and infrastructure. Ethiopia is the second most populous country in Africa, with around 120 million people, and is highly vulnerable to climate disasters, including flooding and droughts. Then back in May of 2016, similar rains caused floods and landslides that claimed at least 50 lives. This time, however, the scale of the disaster is heart-wrenching. African Union Commission Chief expressed solidarity and said that their hearts and prayers were with the families of the victims. So as the search for more survivors continues with vigor, the community braces for the possibility that the death toll may rise. Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed said that he was deeply saddened by the terrible loss of life and that the federal officials had been deployed to reduce the impact of the disaster. For our next story, we go back to Kenya. On the Lamu Island, which also is a UNESCO World Heritage Site, residents say that donkeys are as dear to them as their family members. They are a crucial part of their household and the island's economy. But the four-legged, tail-wagging lifelong of Lamu is fighting a dangerous and rapidly growing enemy that is threatening an entire ecosystem. Donkeys on the island are dying with their stomachs full of plastic. Over the years, scientists have warned of the effect of plastic on marine life. Now they fear this could be a global problem affecting several species on land too. Our next report gets you the details.
When you hear of a donkey, what's the first thing that comes to your mind? A dumb, stupid animal? Well, in reality, they're anything but that. The idea of donkeys as a dumb animal comes from their stubbornness. In fact, a 2013 study claims they have an excellent memory and a great ability to learn and problem solve as quickly as dogs and dolphins. They're also very affectionate animals. Donkeys usually form very strong bonds with their companions and can become ill if separated from them. In East Africa's Kenya, many donkeys are battling the grief of separation. This is because they're losing their friends and companions to one common threat: plastic. This is the Kenyan island of Lamu, a UNESCO heritage site known for preserving its Swahili culture. Here, donkeys are the backbone of most households. They're passed on from one generation to the next. With no cars but nearly 3,000 donkeys on the islands, residents rely on them for a living. These animals ferry residents and tourists. They also transport cargo in the narrow lanes of the 700-year-old town, one of East Africa's oldest. But green pastures for the donkeys on the Lamu island are fast shrinking. With little grass to graze on, they are commonly seen browsing through heaps of plastic bottles, nappies and other scrap material for food. In an extremely worrying sign, an increasing number of donkeys are dying from eating plastic on the island. They are consuming enough plastic to block their digestive tracts, leading to starvation and death. For years, scientists and researchers have studied the impact of plastic pollution on marine life. But the effect on land animals is far less known. Researchers from the University of Portsmouth and the Donkey Sanctuary are now diving into this. Not just donkeys, researchers fear many other land animals too may be affected by human plastic pollution. They say at least 3 donkeys die a month from colic caused by eating from rubbish dumps, but the number could be far higher. In 2022, researchers in the UK found that plastic was being eaten by more than half the small mammal species tested. The most common was polyester, probably from clothing. In India, scientists found rubbish in the dung of over 30% elephants tested. This included glass, rubber and, of course, plastic. It has also affected more macaques in Indonesia. While scientists continue to study what plastic waste is doing to animals on land, the donkey welfare crisis has left the islanders of Lamu in a state of panic. The entire town, built on the back of donkeys, says losing a donkey is as painful as losing a family member.
And that's it on the show for today. We will see you again tomorrow at the same time. Thank you for watching and goodbye.
A plane crashed.